Thank you so
All
much. And in
right.
listening to the almost the last half of John's talk, he kept talking about network monitoring, and he's talking about it coming back. Well, as far as I know, it never went away, and it's a perfect introduction to my next guest, a good friend of mine, Andy Laman, who's going to talk exactly about that, and in particular, what's going on with encrypted DNS and how we can defend against it, things to watch for, and we're going to get to see some packets. So it's the highlight of the day for me. Please, Andy, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Dave. And I'm super excited for John talking because now, he's already talked about Quick, which is like one of my favorite protocols. And I've been doing a lot of work on Quick lately. So super excited about that. And DNS and encrypted DNS, which is what we're going to talk about now today. Just one note, at the last Secure the Fortress thing we did, I can't remember when I think it was April, I actually did a talk that you can find. It's been posted on actually carving files out of Quick data. So just what John spoke of, you definitely want to be sure you're using at least Wireshark 4.2. 4.4 works as well, but they are significantly beneficial in being able to do that work, especially around the QPAC header compressions. So anyway, we'll move away from Quick. Well, we're going to talk about Quick a little bit here in a second anyway, but let's talk a little bit about DNS, or the domain name system. So my name is Andy Laman. I am an instructor and author for 503, and I'm addicted to packets. I've been looking at packets now for a very, very, very long time, which I guess ultimately means I'm old and I still like packets. So let's keep going and let's talk about DNS. Now, DNS is always the issue, right? It's the network. The network is always the issue, and the network breaks DNS or DNS breaks the net. I don't know. Somewhere in here, networking and DNS are always the problem. DNS is the way that we resolve names to IP addresses or vice versa. And just a level set for everybody, generally speaking, you have some client out here, your system wants to go to some site, and most humans use names for those sites. So it would ask its local DNS server or service, depending on where that happens to be hosted, hey, where's this particular site that I'm going to? Now, the local DNS server will check its cache. If it knows about it or the information is actually in its cache itself, it will send the reply back. If it does not, it needs to go find out. Now, if it knows who's already authoritative for that, it could go ask the authoritative server directly. Otherwise, it's going to go out and ask one of the root DNS servers and say, hey, where's this particular site that we're trying to go to? And they'll say, oh, go ask whoever the authoritative name server is for it, and we'll get a response back. And then the local DNS server will go out and ask the public authoritative server for it and say, hey, where's this particular site? And it'll return us an IP address, and the user can ultimately go out and make its connection to wherever it happens to be going. Now, the interesting thing about this is notice how many points of access are, well, not in your internal network, right? There's some question that could come out to one of the root servers. You're going out to whoever the authoritative server is. Maybe your recursive server, which is basically who's going to find that answer for you, lives out on the internet. So you're actually asking the internet a lot of places for this information. Where this turns out to be very interesting is DNS is not encrypted by default. Now, DNS has been around. I think the original protocol was submitted as a standard in 1987, so it's a couple years old, but it is not an encrypted protocol, which means if I can see the traffic, I can see where you're going. But there's, in addition to that, so besides the privacy risks associated with that, so I can figure out where you're going, I could, potentially profile the sites that you're going to and look at the particular data or where you're trying to get to as either a user or an organization. I can also do things like spoofing. I can do cache poisoning attacks, hijacking attacks, which basically means if I can see the traffic, I can actually respond to it. It kind of ends up being a race condition in some cases, where if I can see it, I can go, hey, you know what? I want you to go here instead of where you were trying to go to. So it turns out to be very, very nice, not only for attackers to be able to lure you or move you over to their systems, but also it turns out to be a great way for your ISPs to track where you're going to, or maybe direct you to new services. Or now I know none of you actually make typographical mistakes, but if instead of typing like google.com, you type googly.com, like I may do, and my ISP likes to go, hey, that domain is not owned by anybody, but for $19.95, I'll be glad to sell you that domain, which then turns out to be, them just spoofing or trying to sell me additional services. In addition to that, it's also used for command and control channels, as John's talked about, or alluded to. It can be used for tunneling other protocols, because you don't necessarily even have to talk to the command and control channel. You just have to be able to ultimately send commands to a DNS server that you own or support. So there's lots of not only privacy issues because it's not encrypted, but it's also being used for different types of attacks. So what I want to kind of focus on, the piece of it, is what's happening around the encryption of it, because the privacy piece of it, we definitely don't want people monitoring our traffic unless they're supposed to be monitoring our traffic, which I guess is good and bad from a defender perspective. But the other side of it is, if they're using encrypted DNS style attacks and we're not looking or noticing those type of attacks, then we're blind, just like what John was talking about in his presentation. So this is just a sample of Wireshark. What I'm going to call out here multiple times is the DNS packet itself. And you can see here, Wireshark does an amazing job of being able to break that down. So we'll look at that here in a minute. Now, again, there's several different ways you can actually do DNS encryption and encrypt your DNS data. Some of them are newer than others. Most of them are standards-based that we're going to talk about. The first one we're going to look at, DNS Crypt, is not standards-based, but it did have some traction several years ago, though I've not seen it used legitimately in a while. One of the things we're not going to talk about, though, is DNSSEC. So DNSSEC is DNS Security Extensions. It's actually not encrypted DNS. It's authentication and integrity of DNS resource record sets. So it's beneficial, but it's actually not encrypted. It's just adding some additional integrity to that lookup to be sure that it came from an approved or at least a signed source. So we're not really going to talk about it in this particular presentation, just because we're going to focus on the encrypted piece of it. Before we start looking at these different ways that we can actually encrypt DNS data, I want to at least highlight that DNS has a format. It's a binary format. It's got a header. It's got different fields in it. We're not going to jump into what the fields mean like what we do in 503. We'll talk about what all the flags mean and all the different pieces and how it works. I want you just to be more familiar with the fact that it's got a header, and you can actually see it in the packets itself. So now Wireshark and some of our tools do an amazing job of decoding this for us. So we sometimes lose perspective that it is actually this binary formatted data that's actually getting sent across the network, because you can see here, hey, the transaction ID is whatever this hex value is that Wireshark will automatically decode for us. That lands here in the actual payload. So this isn't just an unencrypted DNS over UDP port 53. And that actually lands here in the actual payload itself. So it's a 2-byte field, which is our 2-byte identification number, or query ID, or transaction ID, or message ID, depending on what you read, what they call it. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be looking at. So this is the beginning of the payload here with the transaction ID. Wireshark can help us decode it. And this is the payload that aligns with these different fields. Okay, so I'll reference back to this a couple times as we work through there. The first protocol we're going to look at is DNS Crypt. Now, DNS Crypt, I generally don't see in organizations or agencies on purpose. We'll go with that. So generally speaking, it's suspicious whenever I see it. So it runs on port 443, TCP and UDP, but it is definitely not HTTP. It actually really sticks out if you're looking at your traffic, which turns out to be a really, really nice way to detect this. It's not an official standard. They never actually submitted it for an RFC, but it does use standard-based encryption algorithms. How it works is you send the client has to know who the resolver is that they want to talk to, and they have to trust that particular public key. So they send to that known resolver an unencrypted DNS text query. So DNS has several different types. So you've got your address record type, or an A record, which is like an IP version 4, a quad A record, which is like an IP version 6. You've got non-existent domain, and which would be your NX domain records. There's lots of different record types. One of them is a text record type, or a TXT, and it sends unencrypted. So you can actually see this if you're looking at your port 443 traffic. So it's really, really important to be monitoring your traffic. You can see this, and it actually sends, and it includes a provider name, the version of DNS Crypt, and then some cert information, and then this zone information, which has to be valid formatted zone, not necessarily a valid zone itself. If the resolver recognizes or understands what you're trying to do, it will send back some short-term keys and a reply that are then used for the key exchange using one of their encryption algorithms. And then it uses padded data to actually encrypt it. And then the actual query goes across encrypted, and you get the reply back. This is definitely not HTTP. So if you're monitoring your traffic and looking at this traffic, it is actually really, really easy to detect. What I found, though, is some organizations go, oh, that's TCP port 443, it's encrypted, we can't look at it, which goes to John's point about we need to be doing something here. And they just totally ignore it, which means this works perfectly fine with no detection, even though it should stick out like a sore thumb. Okay, so DNS Crypt. Okay, the next one, now this one for me is really approachable, because this protocol, so it's DNS over TLS, this is DNS literally running right on top of TLS. It uses TCP port 853 as its default port. And basically you have your TCP process, so your SYN, your SYNAC, your ACK, and your client hello, server hello, key exchange for TLS. And then DNS, literally that DNS packet sits right on top, and your query, you get your reply back, and then you can terminate your session, FINAC ACK, or however you want to terminate your session. You can also have multiple queries over this same session itself. So that ends up being really nice for performance reasons. Now, this does not perform as well as UDP DNS because, well, one, we're adding encryption, so there's overhead, but TCP's got more latency in it because I've got to do a three-way handshake, and then I've got to do the key exchange. Then I've also got the overhead of the variable length TCP header plus the terminating of the connection itself. So there's definitely some issues here, but you're getting encrypted DNS traffic, which turns out to be really, really nice. Again, from that privacy perspective. You also have to kind of think about it from the fact of if an attacker's using this, they're getting encrypted DNS traffic as well. With DNS over TLS, you can also send multiple queries over that same session. So the message ID, that two byte transaction ID or message ID or DNS query ID, that field is how it's tracked in this session itself. But TCP runs into a particular problem called ahead of line blocking. And it's how the TCP protocol works for making sure that we've got reliable communication and all the segments or packets are arrived and processed correctly. Even if I make multiple queries, I can't process or receive until I get the response back from the other side. So there's some head of line blocking and, again, some additional performance issues here. But generally speaking, there's many, many protocols that run on top of TLS, and this works perfectly fine with that particular model. Let's see. So the next one I want to look at, it turns out to be, where'd my clicker go? There we go. Turns out to be probably one of the more popular ones that I'm seeing right now. And for me, it's kind of strange. I mean, because It's DNS running on top of or inside of HTTP traffic, on top of TLS, on top of TCP. So now it's great because I'm getting encrypted DNS. So from a privacy perspective, my tongue quit working. From a privacy perspective, that's great. That's fantastic. It's also really nice because it runs over TCP port 443 or UDP port 443 if we're talking about quick and HTTP 3. But it runs over those ports, which makes it also harder to detect. For example, with DNS over TLS, it's on TCP port 853. I can see that, or at least recognize that particular port. So what turns out to be interesting with this is it's actually hard to detect, which is great from privacy perspective, maybe not so great from a defender perspective. Now, with this, it kind of feels a little weird again, because for me, HTTP is not really a transport layer protocol. I know we can carry things and stuff, but I don't know, it just feels a little bit weird. Anyway, it's built into most browsers, and it's turned on by default. So unless you're actively managing the browsers on your systems, you may already be using this without knowing it. So how this works is via a GET or a POST request inside of HTTP itself. But this is where I've seen it trip up some analysts, especially SOC analysts, who end up getting freaked out when they're looking at their logs. And I want to kind of highlight this just a little bit. So let's start with the POST, because the POST is way more approachable. So here's the message, and how it works is it's literally an HTTP post. It uses the same error code. So successful would be a 200 something, some error message. All it's HTTP. It's just got a couple different particular items for DNS itself. So one, the path's going to be a DNS query, and the application and content type are going to be DNS messages. So you just send a post, whoever the authority is that you're trying to communicate to, and then the content length is literally the length of whatever your DNS packet is. And you send in the content, so space followed by the DNS packet itself. And this goes straight as a post, and then you get the response back from the server itself. So this turns out to be very, very nice, at least an approachable way if you like your DNS traffic running over HTTPS, and it's built into all the different browsers. This has caught people by surprise before, because they expect this to be in the body, like the domain that you're looking for, like www.evilandy.net, I think is the example I used here, right? And that's what they expect to see, but it's not. It's actually the payload, that DNS payload itself. It's actually a DNS packet that you're sending across in this post message. So that turns out to be really, really nice. The GET is a little bit more convoluted. It's not impossible to get through. It just turns out to be a little strange. And I've ended up working with some SOCs, and they freaked out before, because they're like, it's terrible, it's malicious, command and control channel, we're being attacked or something, right? Because again, people expect this to be the domain that you're looking for, www.evilandy.net. And it doesn't look like that. So get the scheme, and then in this case for the path, you just DNS query $DNS, and then this weirdness here. The weirdness, well, first off, it looks nothing like what we're looking at in that packet itself. But it turns out that it actually is the DNS packet. So we're gonna actually call our good friend CyberChef to help us out here. So what that is it's a base 64 URL encoded message of that DNS packet. So if you take, again, the DNS payload itself, so here's the beginning of that transaction ID. So here's our A4B1 in hex transaction ID. Here's the end. If we take that and put it in our input, and I'm just using, again, CyberChef because this makes it a little bit more approachable to read. Now, you want to be sure that you say from hex here. You've got to be sure that you're doing this, because otherwise it's just going to try and convert these as ASCII characters. And that's not what we're looking for. We want this hex data to get converted. And then we want to convert that from hex to base 64, but you have to do URL safe base64 encoding, because some of the characters in base64 don't translate very well and doesn't work out really nice. So that's what this actual message is. So if you see this show up in the logs, you actually have to do a little bit of work if your tool doesn't recognize what that is. And I found very, very few tools do. Wireshark does, which is great. So if you've got decrypted HTTPS traffic, you open up Wireshark. Wireshark will help you do this. Not all tools are as good. So you just want to be careful with that. And then just to kind of show you this works, I just used curl in this case to send that strangeness over, and you can see we get a reply back. And notice here's the IP address that we've been looking at that turns out to be the reply for that particular IP address. So that ends up being a very, very interesting, a little bit kind of crazy way to work through this DNS over HTTPS. Okay, let's see here. Just double check the questions here. Make sure that we're okay here. Oh, okay, cool. Thanks, John. Okay, well, I'm going to let that keep going for now and move the questions off the slide. Okay, let me know if there's any questions, and I'll kind of get to them at the end if we need. So that's DNS over HTTPS. Now, again, this is built into all the different browsers that we've got. So we just want to be sure that we understand where this is and what we're looking at when we start working on this, especially as this stuff starts showing up in the logs. Okay, the last one, this one is really, really new. Well, one, because Quick is really new. Two, because DNS support over Quick is very new. And the first applications to be able to support it just came out a couple months ago. So I've been playing around with it quite a bit lately. One, I'm a bit of a fanboy of Quick. So I say don't block it because it's amazing. But as a defender, if you don't have tools to support it, it may be better to block it because tool support is very poor right now. Very poor. But from a network engineer who's really old and cranky, this is a very nice protocol. So Quick is a transport layer protocol that runs on top of another transport layer protocol called UDP. It supports, well, HTTP 3 was one of the bigger component pieces of it, but it also now supports SMB, which is fantastic. Again, old network guy, but also there's some streaming protocols. In addition, DNS over Quick is officially supported as well. And there's actually tools and applications to support this. This feels like the best fit for me, not just because I'm a fanboy of Quick, but because it's over UDP, which kind of is how DNS should be. You know, simple request and I get my response back. You know, simple request and get my response back. But we want it to be encrypted from the privacy perspective using known protocols that we can support, and hopefully, ultimately, our tools will catch up to us and help us as defenders be able to detect against that. So it also uses port 853, but it uses UDP port 853. So a little bit different than DNS over TLS, which was TCP port 853. This is UDP port 853, and you can actually run both on the same server depending on how you have your server configured itself. The payload itself, again, is a DNS packet. You can actually also have multiple packets running in, well, Quick uses streams, so I can run multiple different streams to the particular server that I'm talking to and have multiple different query and replies going on at the same time. One of the benefits around this is Quick eliminates or reduces the head-of-line blocking issue that TCP has. So because each is in their own individual streams, and you can have multiple streams in the same packet, and it's all around the Quick protocol itself. Quick will manage that for you, so you don't run into any of those head-of-line blocking or processing issues, which turns out again to be a little bit more efficient in how this works, which is really, really nice. The message ID, if you start decoding these, is actually going to be 0 because the message ID, the DNS message ID, is actually not used to correlate the reply to the response. It's the connection information that Quick uses, the connection IDs. So Quick actually manages pairing of the query and reply together. So it turns out to be a very, very nice way to encompass that. Another thing that gets really, really interesting with this is that on your initial connection to a server supporting QUIC, so you send your initial with your client hello, server responds back with its initial with the server hello, and we do encrypted communication and we can start doing queries. So very, very low latency round trips compared to like TCP. After we've communicated before, we can pre-share keys and connection IDs. So if I have to ask you a question again, I can say, hey, remember me? I need this DNS name information. Here's my query. And the server will recognize that and respond. So if I can do session resumption, and in addition to this, QUIC is not port IP and port dependent because we use this thing called a connection ID. So my connection can migrate to different IP addresses or to different locations. So again, from a privacy perspective, this is fantastic. This is really, really nice. From a defender perspective, though, this gets to be very challenging because now I don't necessarily, well, one, in the initial, in the QUIC packets, there can be padding as well as multiple streams within that. So I don't necessarily know this happens to be whatever it is that I'm looking at. Now, in this case, because it's running over UDP port 853, we have some indication, but I don't know how many queries, how long it is. But with the connection migration, I can make my initial request over the wireless network and then, I don't know, use Wi-Fi somewhere else or my mobile phone or whatever it happens to be the device I'm using and have that additional connection out there. So it turns out to be really, really a nice way or a creepy, scary way, depending on your perspective for what you're trying to solve for. So recommendations, monitor DNS. If you are not monitoring your DNS data, whatever that happens to be, well, one, you need to figure out where your DNS data is, where it lives, who's collecting it, and look at it. This is an incredible source of intelligence for your organization. It is very, very important. You need to be sure that you understand what your tools can support as well. And as John indicated, maybe you need to block some of these protocols if your tools can't support them. Now, the different protocols have different benefits, and again, from the privacy perspective or a defender perspective, depends on how you're looking at this. But for example, DNS over TLS, again, lots of protocols support direct access over TLS, so that should be pretty easy for support from the support category. But on the cons, well, one, if I'm going for privacy, port 853 TCP is the port that it listens on. I know now what that happens to be if I'm trying to avoid detection. So from a privacy perspective, DNS over HTTP may be a little bit better because it's all running over port 443, and all major browsers support it today, which is good. So it's harder to detect. But then on the defender side of it, there's different cookies, there's e-tags, there's user agent strings, there's all kinds of different tracking information that could be included in that because it's just HTTP, which again now is somebody tracking me, and what's the risk there? Now, I'm not saying any browser is doing it, and I have not seen any of the major browsers including any cookies or any of the tracking information in their protocols here, but it's something that is possible and you need to kind of think about. Plus, with this and DNS over TLS, we've got the overhead of, well, the TCP three-way handshake, the latency involved in that, the round trip delay time, and then we've also got the HTTP overhead that's related to this. DNS over QUIC also has some really, really positive things, less overhead, connection migration, session resumption, but there's limited support, limited visibility, limited tools to help us be able to defend. So again, understand where your tools are and what you can or can't do with these tools will help you try and figure out what we can monitor, or more importantly, use to accomplish. Now, for our protection side of it. So from a protection standpoint, look, if you're not using this, block UDP and TCP port 853. Now, this obviously would not block DNS over HTTPS. So maybe you want to block known external resolvers, right? So, but then you kind of have to know who those resolvers are. or maybe better, maybe have a block all and only allow approved, which I know it gets more challenging on port 443, especially if you're not doing already some sort of terminating proxy or a break and inspect type of situation. But that may be a better scenario here because that would then cover your DNS over HTTPS. Be sure you're managing your browsers. If you're not using or supporting DNS over HTTPS, go into your browsers and turn it off because it's on by default. So your clients are probably using this, and if you're not looking, you're probably missing some of this. It's really, really, really important. Or maybe implement encrypted DNS internally, which is a recommendation, and I'm starting to see it come out of several recommended guides as well, to actually implement encrypted DNS internally yourself and then manage that. So the risk there is we're now blinding the network tools a little bit more because now they're not going to be able to see those clear DNS queries and replies. But realistically, if we're managing that infrastructure correctly, we should be seeing that information in our DNS servers as well, and we should be monitoring that, right? So be sure that we're monitoring that. In addition, we can apply the same techniques that we've been using already with our sinkholes, our block lists, bad sites, only allowed to these top sites, or whichever strategy that you're using there. And while prevention is and protections are great, if we don't detect, we can't respond. So we need to think about some detection techniques and be creative here. Again, trying to be more data-driven, come up with ways to be a little bit more creative in the information that we're looking at. So monitor for traffic on, TCP or UDP port 853. Why is any of my clients, why are any of my systems even trying to connect to that if I'm not using it? Monitor for connections to external resolvers, whether you're blocking or they're successful or not. Why do I have systems that are trying to set or access those devices straight off? Break and inspect techniques, terminating proxies, next generation firewalls. Similar things that what John talked about is making sure that, hey, we need to be inspecting what's inside of these things and at least looking at it, because if we're not looking at it, well, somebody else may be. So we want to be really, really careful with that. And then a couple of additional concepts that we actually teach in 503 as well is doing more behavioral analysis and anomaly detection style techniques. For example, and I've got two just on the slide here as two examples that we utilize. One is we use Zeek scripting to actually look for outbound request when there was not a previous DNS lookup for that. So think about that. Just for a second, that's really, really powerful, because how many of your internal systems should make an outbound request that didn't do a DNS lookup first? Could that be an indication of, well, somebody going directly to an IP address, which would be strange, could be malware, command and control channel, something of that nature, or it could be somebody's resolving their DNS information some other encrypted way that we have no visibility into or we missed. Another way to kind of build on some of what Dave talked about this morning is Dave had built some autoencoders for class based off of network protocols. So basically he took a whole bunch of network protocols and he said, hey, here's the whole bunch of this network protocol. Use an autoencoder to break it down and figure out what it looks like. And then we use on day 5 the autoencoders to detect protocols that may or may not be normal protocols. So that anomalous behavior, which could be very interesting when we're looking at things, for example, like DNS Crypt or things running over HTTP or protocols that it may not necessarily be the right place to be able to look at those. Okay, and I think that gets us to where we are at the end here. Hopefully that wasn't too quick, and if anybody has any questions, please let me know. I'm just skimming here real quick. Cool.
Yeah, there's no questions waiting, Andy, but that was phenomenal. Thank you so very much. And it worked so well with what John had been talking about.
He set me up perfect, and I had no idea. I would have had another whole hour on Quick if I knew that we were doing this. I didn't get the message. I'm so sorry. I ruined it.
Love teeing up talk about Quick.
Just one, students in class are now, they're like, don't ask him any questions about ICMP or Quick. Otherwise, we're not getting out tonight.
I know. It really matters, though. It's become one of the most important protocols that will change how everything works. Thank
I
you
think
so
so
much.
too. It is very interesting. I really am fascinated by it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, John, it seems like it was a pretty successful event. What do you think?
Yeah, very successful. We saw a bunch of awesome topics for everything from CIA to zero trust to OSINT to quick and everything in between. So a lot of awesome stuff.